Well, thank you very much, Elder. It's a pleasure to be with you. Happy Sabbath, Southside. I bring you greetings from the Lake Union Conference, where I serve as the legal counsel and the religious liberty director, as well as Andrews University in the seminary. I also teach church history in the seminary department there. And this has been a very busy month because this is the exact month of the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And I need to add an announcement to the announcements that were made today, and I didn't see it in the bulletin either, but the reason that I'm here is that there is a very special program taking place this afternoon. Your conference has been working with the Union, as well as the Lake Region Conference, to create a special afternoon to consider this 500th anniversary. And more importantly, it's not just a history lesson, it's about what that anniversary means today. And we have a PARL, Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Rally, entitled Martin Luther, Religious Liberty and Social Justice Today. And we're going to talk about some history, but we're also going to talk about some very concrete issues in our world and in our country today that we believe need to be responded to in the same kind of way that Martin Luther protested some of the abuses in his world. So I hope that you will all consider joining many churches in the area. There's 7 or 8 of us that are speaking at a variety of churches in the Indianapolis area this morning on this topic of religious freedom. And we're inviting the members to join us at 4:30. What time did I say? 4:30. That's right. At the Capitol, is it the Capitol Hill Church? Capitol City Church in Indianapolis. Capitol City Church. What church? Yes. At what time? 4:30. Very good. And if someone needs an address, speak with me afterwards, but I think it's easily found on Google. I just returned from a very exciting trip throughout Europe, following the footsteps of the Reformation, actually beginning earlier with the early church in Rome, seeing the catacombs where Peter died, then up to the Waldense valleys, and finally into the heart of Germany, the stomping grounds of Martin Luther, where he was born, where he studied, where he became a monk, where he gave his first Mass, the monastery that he found righteousness by faith in, and then where he stood before the Holy Roman Emperor and declared, "Here I stand on conscience and the Bible and can do no other." I wanted to share with you a brief taste of this experience. The question is sometimes asked, is the Reformation over? Rumors have been swirling about that Protestants have signed a declaration and an agreement with the Pope that actually brings the Reformation to an end. That's not true, but there is a story behind that story that there is some truth to. And that is not all Protestants, but the Lutheran Worldwide Federation, as far back as 1999 actually, entered into a joint statement of agreement on the doctrine of justification by faith with the Catholic Church. Now that's very interesting, isn't it, that they would do this. This was followed a few years later by the Methodist Worldwide Communion. Now I should make clear that the Lutheran Worldwide Federation does not speak for all Lutherans. Certainly doesn't speak for all Protestants, but it speaks for a significant section of the Lutheran community, and similarly the Methodist Worldwide Communion does not speak for all Methodists, and certainly not all Protestants. But it is interesting that at least a significant section of Protestantism has come to believe that our views of righteousness and justification by faith are similar enough to the Catholics that we should withdraw our protest. Now, again, did I say all Protestants? No. not even all Lutherans. But this year, 1 year ago last week, the Pope got together with the Worldwide Lutheran Church, and they signed a document, again, of accord and unity, and agreeing to celebrate this 500th anniversary year together. And they again met on the actual October 31 at the end of last week and reaffirmed this commitment to unity and togetherness. Now, was this all Protestants? No. Was it all Lutherans? No. But it was people representing several million of Lutherans. And so I found it of particular interest to go to Rome this time. How many of you remember the story in the Great Controversy about Martin Luther visiting Rome, and this corrupt city that so disappointed him? But he was still enough of a son of the church and a believer in relics and the Pope that he found himself climbing a staircase. Do you remember this story? Pilate's staircase, which apparently had been brought from the Middle East many years earlier, centuries earlier, and he'd been promised an indulgence. And he climbs this staircase until he hears a voice from heaven, probably in his head, but clear enough for him. And what did it say? The just shall live by faith. And he got up from his knees, and he lived forever after to oppose indulgences. Now, did you know that staircase still exists in Rome today? We had the chance to visit it, and so it was with amazement that I watched pilgrims still climbing that staircase today on their knees. If the Catholic Church believes in justification by faith, why are pilgrims still climbing the staircase on their knees to gain indulgences? I filmed this and made a little video. It's about 3 minutes long, and I want to try to share it with you this morning. Let's see if I can find it's over here, I see. So this is a video I put together on the steps of the church called Sancta Scala, which literally means holy stairs. And this church is, let's see, I've got the video on my screen here and not on the screen in the back, so I probably need to change a setting so that I mirror the screens. Show mirroring options. Yeah, good. That will give us the arrangement. Mirror displays. Okay, so far so good. Let's get rid of that. Are we up there? Okay. So I do about a video a week, and if you are interested in this video, if you're on Facebook, find the Lake Union Public Affairs Facebook page, and I have this video and a number of others, including one I'm showing this afternoon from the steps of the Wittenberg Church, where Luther actually posted his 95 Theses. So here we go. We did have sound, but it's stalling. Not sure what I did. Something went wrong. Oh dear. Learn more. So I'm having trouble with my internet connection. Okay, it ran over to the Southside church, and I know that I have a hotspot on my phone that was working pretty well a little earlier. Let me just give that a try. All right, here we go. All right, I think I may just have to describe the video to you, unfortunately, unless it comes back to life. Anyway, at these stairs, you have pilgrims climbing on their knees. And the question is, if you climb the stairs on your knees, you get something that's called a plenary indulgence. Do you know what a plenary indulgence is? Sounds like forgiveness of sins, right? And what it means is that you will be forgiven all of the temporal punishment of your sins. And what that means is, as Adventists, we only think in terms of, well, either you go to heaven or you don't. But the Catholic mindset, the reason they could sign the document with the Lutherans on justification was they divide the punishment of sin into two categories, eternal punishment and temporal punishment. And they say that it's true, to avoid eternal punishment, you need to have faith in Christ. And this is justification by faith. But there's the temporal punishment of sins, and the church can remit these based on your good works, whether it's climbing staircases on your knees, going through special doors on holy days, or paying for a special mass to be said on your behalf. What is temporal punishment? Well, they would include in that category penances that priests and popes lay on you, but they would also include, have you heard of purgatory? Purgatory is if you're not a saint, not perfect enough to go directly to heaven, you could live for hundreds of years, thousands of years, even millions of years, working your way out of this unpleasant place called purgatory. And climbing stairs on your knees and doing these other good works will remit the punishment of these sins. That's what the church taught in Martin Luther's day. He was actually climbing those stairs on his knees to bring out the soul of his grandfather from purgatory. So this teaching, the church may appear as though it changes, but does it really change? And I think the answer is no. And we have evidence of on Pilate's staircase this very week that I saw with my own eyes. Now, as Adventists, we might like to smile and feel a little smug, or maybe a little sorry for these people. But let me ask you this question. Do we have our own acts of indulgences that we think brings us favor with God ourselves? Are there things we do on a weekly basis that we believe help God smile on us? What might those things be? Maybe even coming to church on Sabbath, maybe even eating a certain diet or dressing in a certain way. And it's not that these things aren't good to do, but if they serve as the basis of our salvation, of our confidence in God, then we're doing the same thing that Luther did and that our Catholic friends do when they seek their indulgences. I think it's verse 20 of the scripture reading today is a verse that Adventists have a hard time coming to terms with. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. For without the law, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. And in verse 19, we know what the law saith. It saith to them who are under the law. Are we under the law? And as Adventists, we like to say, well, not exactly, but you still need to keep the law, right? You need to keep the law, but we're not under the law. But sometimes, I think experientially, we have a hard time distinguishing those two. I remember this being brought to my mind directly when I was studying the book of Galatians as a law student in New York City. So Adventists like to argue over the book of Galatians and the law there, and Paul uses similar language that he uses here. We're not under the law, and those under the law are under a curse. What does this mean? Adventists have argued over whether this reference to law means only the ceremonial law, right? We're not under the ceremonial law. We don't have to do those sacrifices and circumcision and rituals associated with the temple. But it can't mean the moral law. The moral law is good, and it outlines the path to righteousness and holiness. And so you may remember the story of 1888 in our early church. And there was an argument between Jones and Wagner on one side and Smith and Butler and some of the old guard on the other side. And Smith and Butler were wanting to say, no, this talking about not being under the law is not being under the ceremonial law. The moral law still continues. And Jones and Wagner said, no, this is referring to all law, ceremonial law, moral law, it doesn't matter. And can you remember Ellen White ultimately, she didn't want to resolve the issue, but she ultimately joined a side, didn't she? And which side did she join? Jones and Wagner. She believed that their message was from heaven, and that we as Adventists had made a mistake, not in preaching the fact that the law displayed righteousness, but that the law was a method for our salvation. And she said Galatians and Romans are talking about all law, ceremonial and moral law. So I studied this while I was a law student, and it made me wonder whether we as Adventists are so focused on our own little internal cultural disputes that we have lost an ability to connect with a larger world. Because as I looked at my classmates, I went to Sabbath school and we'd argue about the moral law and the ceremonial law, and then I'd go back to school and look at my classmates and think, wow, this isn't really very relevant to them, is it? Are they caught up in whether they need to keep the ceremonial law? No. Are they caught up about whether they need to keep the moral law? Not really, right? They're living their own lives free from any of these religious laws. 90+% of my class was deeply secular. And so it puzzled me that how can we reach this more secular crowd? You know, it's one thing if you're dealing with a Jew who's bound by these laws. You can release them with this message of freedom from Christ. But what about all my secular friends? Are they all free already, and I need to make them feel guilty first to understand the obligations of the ceremonial and moral law, and now I can free you for something? They're going to laugh at me. We're free already, right? Do you have secular friends in the workplace or at school that you have this sort of problem with? I mean, we live in a largely secular society. This mulling over ceremonial versus moral law is kind of a unique Adventist thing these days. And yet, this passage that we read, verse 23, says that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, and that all of us should be attracted by being justified freely by His grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. And as I looked at my classmates and observed them and observed myself, I began to see that even though they didn't care about the ceremonial law and really didn't care about the moral law, that they were under another kind of law. And I call this the law of success. Everyone out there wants to be successful in the eyes of their family, their colleagues, their friends. And here we were at an Ivy League law school, deeply, deeply borne down by the pressure of doing well, right? This first year was so important. Getting good grades could determine what clerkship you got in the summer, which would determine your next step. And so everyone, they wouldn't have said they were under any kind of legal or ceremonial law, but they were under this tremendous weight of the law of success. So much to the point that several of them had breakdowns during that first semester. Smart kids who'd come through top schools and now found themselves in the pressure cooker of law school. There was one friend of mine, at least an acquaintance, who in the middle of the first set of exams had a breakdown in the middle of the exam and got up from the classroom where the test was being administered and ran screaming from the room and had to be hospitalized for a few days. And fortunately, he recovered and came back and finished. But it just illustrated the great intensity of this law that people were under. And I began to recognize it in myself, and it was brought starkly to my mind after that we got the first grade for the first class that we had completed. And I'd been a good student, went to Pacific Union College, and had mostly had A's most of the time, and that's why I'd gotten into this good law school. And so I was not prepared for the very average grade that I got in that first course. And I was deeply disappointed by it, but I was actually even more disappointed by something else that I detected in myself, that this grade had caused me more shock and unhappiness than it should have. In other words, I was putting too much. I was like, oh, if that's all I'm going to do here, then what's the point of me coming to school here, right? I'm not this special, unique person that can do very well. And as I began to reflect on this response, I began to see that despite my saying that the ceremonial law and the moral law didn't ultimately validate me, that I had become like my classmates, and that I had used this law of success to try to validate me existentially in the eyes of my community and in the eyes of my friends. And that this was being under the law. And it took some spiritual reflection to say, no, I'm not going to allow outward circumstances to define my value before God. That part of righteousness by faith is taking the circumstances of your life, not just the moral and the ceremonial circumstances, but all arenas of endeavor. Think about your work now, or if you go to school now. What is it that you worry about? What is it that brings you a level of angst or anxiety? Are you concerned about validating yourself in the eyes of others? And ironically, often the most successful people are most susceptible to this. Because if you're very successful, it means you've done well all the way along, and you've received external affirmations for the A's that you've gotten and the good performances that you've carried out. And you learn to rest your self-esteem, your sense of validity and worth on this continuing outward approbation and support. And so when it's taken away, sometimes the most successful people, you think they would be the most confident, but the reality is they've come to depend most fully on this external sense of validation from others, from the grade you get from the class. And I just realized, if you believe the Lord has called you to this profession and to this place, and as long as you believed you've put in, your efforts and done what you can, then whatever grade you get, whether it's an A or a C, the Lord is preparing you, and you will still be able to carry out the task that He's calling you to. And your fretting about it is showing a lack of faith in what He's calling you to. Furthermore, it is showing that you are under a law. You maybe think you're free from the ceremonial and the moral law, but you are laboring under this law of success. And the irony here is that in the Adventist church, some of the most liberal people who are, righteousness by faith, and of course not worried about the ceremonial or the moral law, sometimes they're the highest achieving, most hardworking workaholics you can find, right? And they are laboring under this law of success. And so Paul's use of law in both Galatians and Romans, even we who say it's the moral and the ceremonial and the moral law, we're still thinking too narrowly. We haven't thought about it sufficiently well enough to see how it applies to all of our lives, how it applies to all those things we strive to achieve. Now, does this mean that you should have no ambition? Does this mean you shouldn't strive and make efforts? No, of course not. It's sort of like the moral law situation. Of course we want you to keep the moral law. The government generally does, your parents do, and I think even you do. But it's not the basis of your salvation or validity or self-worth. And if it becomes that, then you will find it impossible to keep. This is the paradox. Once you accept the salvation of grace that's based on the decision you make to accept God and His forgiveness and His grace and to commit your life to Him, then you have the confidence and the fear goes away, and you have the ability actually now to truly keep God's law, because the law cannot be kept out of a sense of fear, only out of a sense of love, which is implanted in our hearts. So we look at the passage here in verse 26 is the third element of the passage I want to focus on. To declare, I say at this time, his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of him which believeth in Jesus. So in talking about this righteousness by faith, sometimes the question is raised, why did Christ have to die? Why couldn't we just choose to be better people, and then he could just forgive us and we could do better? You know, if we understand what the right thing to do is, Christ can come and make clear the spirit of the law. And, you know, why do we need a death of Christ? You know, for the most part, I can see why some sinners might need the death of Christ. Like if Adolf Hitler wanted to repent, right? Death is required, and all, you know, and maybe Bonaparte and some other people, but why me? And there's a couple of responses to this. You know, first, the weakness and impotence of human ideology in the face of sin. Have you seen we can't not see it in the news these days. There's been an outbreak of accusations regarding sexual harassment, right? And Harvey Weinstein, this famous Hollywood producer, has come to light. He's just lived this awful, oppressive life for so many years, and it's been hidden. And it's been a scandal from the liberal side of Hollywood and politics. But before the conservatives get too full of themselves, saying, look at what those terrible liberals do, think about the other side of the equation. How many of you have heard the name Bill O'Reilly? Right? Conservative, stalwart ideologue. I'm going to tell those liberals and snowflakes, you know, to pull their lives together and make better choices. And he no longer has a job because 5 or 6 women have complained bitterly. And then just in the last couple of weeks, we discovered that, and of course he denies it all. This is just to get money. And then we discovered that they settled a lawsuit for $32 million. Well, I've been a lawyer for a long time, and I can tell you that's not nuisance value for a lawsuit. Now, the point I'm making here is not to embarrass Weinstein and Riley. They've already embarrassed themselves far beyond anything I can add to it. But the point I want to make is that neither the left-wing ideology or the right-wing ideology save them from being horrible human beings. Right? It's not the problem with what set of principles we think we're committed to. There needs to be a change, a fundamental change in our heart that only Christ and his life and death could bring to us. And there's a more fundamental point here also about when I visited Germany this last week or two. You know, the Holocaust Memorial. Has anyone gone to a Holocaust museum? Right? It's a truly sobering experience. You walk around and you look at the tangible artifacts, the pile of shoes that the victims left. And I went during my time at law school as well, and what struck me was my reaction to this experience. And it wasn't so much the horror of what happened to the Jews, because I knew about that ahead of time. I'd seen enough movies and read enough books. But what struck me more was the reality of the humanity of the Germans, and how like the Germans were to myself in some profound human sense. I was going to this law school in New York City and had done enough reading of history to learn that our academic system was really based on the higher educational system of Germany. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, American educators went overseas to learn about the seminar and the dissertation and the research university, and we imbibed not only their methods but also some of their ideas. And in a sense, they represented the peak of the academic world that we so highly valued and that I was in the middle of participating in. And yet these highly cultured and educated men were able to take that culture and education and do the worst kinds of things possible. And I began to realize for the first time what an alien, an angel looking on from the outside to the world would see when he saw NickMiller. That NickMiller, in his own eyes, wasn't a terribly bad person, and maybe he only occasionally got annoyed with his sister or told a white lie here or there. But what the alien sees is NickMiller with his fallen human nature that is the same nature as Adolf Hitler's and the Nazis and fill in the blank for the worst criminal you can think of. The Weinsteins, given their power, their money, and their opportunity, what is my nature capable of? It is capable of those very things that were carried out there. And I could see why an alien looking on would say, that human nature, NickMiller may only be doing these minor things now, but these demonstrate that he is of the same nature and inclination and potential as these much greater evils. And for the sake of the safety of the universe, NickMiller showing himself to be part of this history of sinful human nature, sorry, we're going to have to let him go because he's not safe. And maybe he hasn't killed anyone, but people with his same very nature have killed someone, and like a mad dog with rabies, we don't wait till they all bite someone, you put them down. And I began to understand the problems with my fallen, sinful human nature. But I went to another museum just last week in Germany, and this one brought me greater hope. It's called the Museum of Resistance, and it documented all those people in Nazi Germany that hadn't just gone along with the tide, with the culture, but had stood up against what they considered to be great evil and tried to put a stick in the spokes and the wheels of evil. Men and women like, you've heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great theologian, who stood up to defend his Jewish brethren and paid the ultimate price. Sylvie Scholl, have you heard of Sylvie Scholl and the White Rose? Surveys are done in Germany about the most admired Germans in German history, and it's a tremendous pantheon of great thinkers, from Mozart to Beethoven to Albert Einstein to Schiller and yet number 3 on the list consistently is Sophie Scholl, a 19-year-old schoolgirl in Nazi Germany who, with her friends, because of her religious faith, decides to start making pamphlets talking about the inhumanity of the Nazis, of their cruelty to humanity and to the Jews and to the handicapped. She and her brother are caught passing these flyers out. They're put on trial, they're interrogated by the SS, put on trial, and both executed in Munich in the closing year of the war. Truly, there's a movie, Sophie Scholl and the White Rose. They rediscovered the interrogation transcripts when the SS questioned her, and they've made a movie based on the actual words that she spoke with her accusers, and it's just remarkable and truly inspiring to see a 19-year-old girl standing up against the face of evil, telling them that they are not representing what Germany's truly about, what God is truly about, and that she has to speak for the weak. A third person, Colonel Stauffenberg. Have you heard of the movie Valkyrie, the plot to assassinate Hitler? Tom Cruise plays this Colonel Stauffenberg. And the reason Stauffenberg opposes Hitler is in good part based on his Catholic faith and his belief that this regime has treated people cruelly and wrongly. Unfortunately, he too is captured. His effort fails. And this Resistance Museum is in the courtyard, or it's around the courtyard, where Colonel Stauffenberg and his fellow plotters, I would call them resistance fighters, were lined up and shot and killed, and the blood stained the pavement of that courtyard. And I reflected on that, and I said, some people might say these individuals failed, and they were foolish in their failure. They should have just kept their mouths shut, been kind and good to people, lived a Christian witness, and then they could have lived in the post-war years, done good for others. And yet as I stood there looking at where Stauffenberg's blood has been spilled, it dawned on me that in some small way, not quite in the way that Christ's blood does, but that in some way the blood of Stauffenberg and of Sylvie Scholl and Dietrich Bonhoeffer had redeemed the history of the German nation. Now, I don't know if there are any Germans here, but if you are a German, in a sense, there's a great national shame about what happened in World War II, right? How did a whole country lose its mind and treat minorities and defenseless people and handicapped so badly and so viciously? Not everyone did it, but most everybody knew about it, and most people did nothing to oppose it. And it could be said, if all of them had supported it and none of them had opposed it, what does it mean to be German? What does it say the German race is capable of? That's your history. You have to own it. But you don't, because Bonhoeffer did what he did. Sophie Scholl did what she did. Stauffenberg did what he did. And you can say as a German, that's my Germany. It goes back from Stauffenberg and Scholl to Martin Luther, and from Martin Luther back to the original martyr, Jesus Christ. And we can choose the history that will inspire, that will outline the course of our lives. We don't have to be German, though, to make this choice, right? All cultures have their failures. All cultures are fallen and human. But Christ has infiltrated all cultures as well, including ours. And there is a line of protest in every culture that you can choose to be a part of. Every day we are given this opportunity. We can stay in the fallen, sinful Adam and be part of the oppressive culture of the world, or we can choose to join the line of protesters that protest against the oppression, the unfairness, the unkindness that surrounds us. We can choose to be part of the Sylvie Scholls, the Bonhoeffers, the Wesleys, the Luthers, the Waldenses, the Peter and the Pauls, the heroes of faith in Hebrews 11. God gives us that grace to make that choice. We can't even do that on our own. We're dependent on Him. We may be attracted by the conviction and courage of Scholl and Bonhoeffer, but we don't have that naturally. That is the Reformation. It's not just a historical event. It's something that has to take place each day in our lives at the beginning of the day, where we say, this is who I want to be. I don't want the history of the first fallen, sinful Adam, which is what most of my world is like. I want this other history. Please give it to me today. Help me to be reformed. Help me to be a protester. Help me be part of that group that says, no, the protest is not over. Will we do that? And what will that protest look like today? Right? Martin Luther believed in sola scriptura, sola fide, sola gratia, solely to the glory of God. But other people did as well. But you don't hear about them. And it was only because Luther put his protest in a concrete statement against abuses in his church and society of his day that challenged financial, economic, and social interests that suddenly people became aware of him. Right? You remember it was a system of indulgences. The Pope wanted to raise money for St. Peter's. And Luther said, well, these beliefs I have will cause me to speak out against this abuse. And that's what brought the attention and wrath of the society he lived in, but it's also what brought the great explosion of gospel understanding and revival. What is it that being a Protestant today means? You can't just say, believe in sola scriptura, sola fide, sola gratia, because it's the applying of those principles to the world around you that makes you a Protestant. So what are those things? What does it mean to be a Protestant today? Well, I've run out of time this morning. So to hear an answer to that question, you're going to need to join us this afternoon at 4:30. Where? Capital City Church. We're going to sing a closing hymn. It is found at number 92. This is my Father's world.